The stars overhead shimmered cold and indifferent as John Carter fought to steady his breath. His pulse thundered in his temples, the aftershock of his crash still rattling through his bones. The once pristine cockpit of his spacecraft now lay in scattered pieces across an alien landscape. What had been a smooth flight home was now an unrecognizable wreck, strewn across jagged rocks and dense alien foliage. The smell of burning metal lingered in the air, thick and acrid, mixing with the damp musk of the wild terrain. "Well, this is a hell of a way to end a mission," John muttered under his breath, standing amidst the wreckage. His left arm hung awkwardly, a slight sting of pain shooting through his shoulder as he adjusted it. The safety harness had done its job, barely, but he had still taken a hard jolt when the ship went into a tailspin. The ship's emergency beacon was disabled. The only thing he could count on was his training. John's mind snapped into tactical mode. The first thing was to assess his surroundings. Scanning the horizon, he saw only an endless sea of dark green foliage, rolling hills in the distance, and a few towering, jagged mountains that looked more like the teeth of some ancient, sleeping beast. The vegetation was alien, thick, and spongy, with odd vines that hung from every branch, dripping with translucent sap. There were no signs of civilization, no structures, no roads, nothing. He took a deep breath, resisting the growing panic that nipped at the edges of his calm. He needed to remain focused. Survival was always about priorities: shelter, water, food, security. Everything else could wait. The first problem, food. His stomach growled loudly, the realization hitting him that he had no supplies. The crash had obliterated the storage compartments of his ship, leaving him with nothing more than the clothes on his back and the weapons at his side. Fortunately, John was resourceful. He pulled a small survival pack from a compartment beneath the wreckage. It was a standard military-grade pack, designed to keep a soldier alive in hostile environments for 48 hours. Inside, he found the basics: a small water purification tablet, a knife, a flare gun, and a compact first aid kit. The flare gun was of little use, but the knife could be a lifesaver. John briefly considered using his comms, but the ship's communications array had been damaged beyond repair. His chances of getting a signal were as good as hoping for rain in the desert. And it wasn't just the ship that was unreliable. His beacon was shot, and even if it worked, he had no idea if any rescue party would even come. The alien landscape presented another challenge. Everything was strange here. The air was dense, thick with the scent of unfamiliar plants, and the sky above looked wrong. It wasn't blue, or even a conventional color, more of a swirling mix of violet and green, creating a surreal, dreamlike atmosphere. John knew from his training that the first rule of survival in unknown terrain was to never assume that the environment was safe, no matter how harmless it appeared. He would have to scout, make sure nothing in the vicinity could pose a threat. John adjusted his jacket, which was fraying at the edges, and grabbed the knife. He moved cautiously through the underbrush, stepping lightly, his sharp military instincts guiding him. The deeper he ventured, the more he noticed how eerily quiet everything was. No chirping of insects, no rustling of small creatures. Just the sound of his boots crushing the damp leaves underfoot. About half an hour into his search, a strange noise caught his attention, a low, rumbling growl. It came from his left, a few dozen meters away. John froze, crouching low to the ground, his senses on high alert. He could hear the crunch of heavy footsteps and the snapping of branches. The creature, whatever it was huge. Slowly, he inched forward, making sure to stay downwind. Through a thick patch of leaves, John spotted something moving. A hulking figure emerged from the dense forest. The creature was humanoid in shape, though larger than any human, with thick, scaled skin and glowing eyes that seemed to reflect the eerie green light from above. Its muscular form was adorned with crude armor made of animal bones and alien plant fibers. The thing sniffed the air, its eyes narrowing as if sensing something, perhaps him, but it didn't seem to be aware of his position just yet. John's instincts kicked in. There were no other creatures in sight, but he knew that nothing on this planet would act like the predators he had trained for back home. Still, The creature seemed slow, lumbering. He could use that. He could take it down with the knife, or, better yet, use the environment to his advantage. John crept behind a cluster of thick, vine-covered trees, keeping his movements smooth and deliberate. The creature continued to pace, seemingly uninterested in its surroundings. Then, without warning, it turned, a deep rumble escaping from its throat. A pair of glowing eyes locked onto him. Instincts flared. He darted, moving faster than the creature could react, and lunged with the knife. The blade sank into its thick hide, and the alien howled in surprise. But that wasn't the end of it. The creature grabbed his arm with its large, scaled hand, twisting with terrifying strength. Pain shot through John's shoulder as he struggled to break free, but the grip was too strong. Using his free hand, John pulled out a small smoke grenade from his pack. Without hesitation, he pulled the pin and threw it to the ground. Thick white smoke billowed up, filling the air. The creature stumbled backward, disoriented. This was his chance. John withdrew from the cloud of smoke, rolling behind a large boulder for cover. He could hear the creature thrashing around, its growls now echoing in the mist. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. Then, something strange happened. The creature suddenly went silent. No growls. No movements. Just an eerie stillness. John's breath quickened as he cautiously peeked around the boulder. The alien was still there, but now it seemed hesitant. As if it were waiting for something. John's military training kicked in again. He couldn't afford to waste time with a monster that might have reinforcements, or worse, be part of something bigger. But something inside him, some primal survival instinct, made him hesitate. Maybe it wasn't the time to kill yet. Instead, John stood slowly, making no sudden movements. He showed the alien his empty hands, a silent offer of truce. The creature's glowing eyes flickered as it observed him, still cautious but no longer hostile. In that brief moment of silence, John realized that this planet might be more dangerous than just hostile wildlife. It was the humans who were truly out of place here, on a world where survival meant more than just strength. It required something else, a deeper understanding, or perhaps something as basic as compassion. John Carter didn't waste time feeling sorry for himself. The crash had left him stranded, but it had also given him the gift of time, a luxury he wasn't going to squander. The wreckage of the ship could provide valuable resources, metal parts for makeshift weapons, durable fabric for shelter, and the fragments of advanced tech that could help him on his journey. But first, he needed to survive the first 72 hours, long enough to assess his situation, build a shelter, and secure fresh water. He moved quickly. His first priority was shelter, and for that, he needed to find a defensible location. The alien terrain was hostile, and as he moved further into the dense undergrowth, the air seemed to grow heavier with every step. The trees here were unlike any Earth species, tall, skeletal structures that rose into the sky with branches that twisted like the arms of an ancient being, their bark pale and sickly. Thick, creeping vines snaked up their trunks, some pulsating faintly with light as if they were alive. The ground beneath him was soft but treacherous, with quicksand-like patches that sucked at his boots, making each step a calculated risk. John knew he needed to find solid ground. The landscape wasn't just unfamiliar, it was dangerous. The wildlife here, though silent, could be far more deadly than the treacherous terrain. After what felt like hours of walking, John finally stumbled upon a small clearing, a pocket of land protected by a series of dense thickets and large rock outcrops. The rocks were jagged, making the area nearly impossible for large creatures to traverse. He decided it was the best place to set up camp, at least for the night. With the last of his energy, he gathered dry wood, broke down parts of the wreckage to find usable metal fragments, and set up a small fire. The heat was comforting, and its light helped him assess his situation further. He still had his pack, a combat knife, and some basic survival gear. His suit had emergency supplies, like a basic water purifier and small rations, but he couldn't rely on them forever. The next task was water. He'd learned the hard way that dehydration could kill a man faster than hunger. Using the metal pieces from the wreckage, John fashioned a crude filtration system, a series of metal pipes and cloth pieces that would purify any liquid he could find. He tested it using water from a nearby stream, and to his relief, it worked. With his basic needs taken care of, he could focus on the real challenge ahead, navigating this strange planet without getting killed. For the next several days, John scavenged for food, becoming more attuned to the alien environment. He noticed large, bioluminescent creatures with glowing tentacles that flitted through the air, high-pitched screeches ringing in the air when startled. He learned how to hunt small, insect-like creatures using a snare trap, and he studied the plants around him for anything edible. Most of the plant life was either poisonous or inedible, but there were a few that seemed to provide some nutritional value, and he was able to ration them. But it wasn't just the natural dangers he had to worry about. The longer he stayed in this alien wilderness, the more he began to feel a looming presence in the air. It wasn't the wind or the rustle of the trees. It was something else, something watching. John's instincts kicked in. He wasn't alone. His senses heightened. He spent the next few days carefully observing the area, setting up crude traps to ensure he wasn't being stalked. Every time he gathered firewood or ventured farther from the clearing, he felt like he was being watched, and it wasn't long before he encountered the first sign of intelligent life. It was early morning when he first saw them, a group of humanoid figures moving stealthily through the trees. Tall, reptilian creatures with smooth greenish scales that seemed to shimmer in the half-light of dawn. Their eyes, large and pupilless, glowed faintly in the darkness, their movements eerily quiet. These were not the simple beasts he'd encountered thus far. They were the tribe that ruled this land. They were the Zalnor. At first, John assumed they hadn't noticed him. But then, one of them, a massive, muscular figure nearly 8 feet tall, turned its head sharply, locking eyes with him. It was as if they had sensed his presence, as if they were attuned to him, despite the distance. Adrenaline surged through John's veins. He dropped to a crouch and quickly scanned his surroundings for cover. The Zalnor weren't just predators, they were hunters, and they had the means to track him down. Without a moment's hesitation, John reached for his combat knife and began to move silently through the foliage, keeping to the shadows. The Zalnor group moved closer, and John's heartbeat quickened as he prepared for the worst. They were closing in, forming a semicircle around him, clearly intent on trapping him. He'd seen enough of their kind to know what this meant. He was the prey. With no time to waste, John ducked behind a thick vine-covered rock and waited. The group moved past him, their heads swaying slightly as they sniffed the air. He held his breath, staying still as death. But they must have sensed something, for the massive leader turned to face his hiding spot. Their eyes locked once more, and in that moment, John felt a primal energy surge through the air, a tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Then, before they could pounce, John made his move. He exploded from his hiding place, charging at the nearest Zalnor, using the element of surprise to his advantage. He slashed his knife across the creature's chest, a clean cut that made the alien stagger back with a hiss of pain. John didn't hesitate. He used the opportunity to deliver a swift kick to its head, sending it tumbling to the ground. The other Zalnor moved in to retaliate, but John was faster. He spun, ducking under an incoming blow, and brought his elbow down on the nearest alien's throat. The sound of bones cracking reverberated through the air. The remaining 2 Zalnor roared in fury, but John was already on the move, dodging their attacks with expert precision. His military training, years of experience in combat and survival, was paying off in ways he couldn't have predicted. In a blur of motion, John disabled the final 2 Zalnor warriors. The one that had been leading the group attempted to engage him in close-quarters combat, but John's skill was too much. With a quick series of strikes, the alien leader crumpled to the ground, incapacitated but alive. As the dust settled, John stood over the fallen aliens, his breath steady despite the chaos. The fight had been quick, brutal, and efficient. The Zalnor weren't prepared for him, not just physically, but mentally. They had underestimated him, and now they were paying the price. But something unexpected happened. Instead of immediately finishing them off, John knelt down beside the leader. There was something in the alien's eyes, something that told him this wasn't just a matter of survival anymore. John's mind raced. He knew that, in a world ruled by violence, understanding the enemy was often more powerful than brute strength. The leader's breathing was shallow, but it was still alive. John took a deep breath, preparing himself for the negotiation. He would either make a truce or risk being hunted by the rest of the tribe. The decision was his to make. John Carter was no stranger to hostile environments. As a seasoned member of Earth's Special Forces, he'd been dropped into some of the most dangerous locations on the planet, from the freezing deserts of Siberia to the dense jungles of South America. But this was something different. The longer he spent in the wilds of this alien planet, the more he realized how unprepared he truly was. The planet's native life forms were unlike anything he'd studied during his brief training sessions with the planetary survival experts. It wasn't just the wildlife that made the landscape menacing, it was the sense that something was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He could feel the presence of eyes on his back whenever he ventured deeper into the jungle, but every time he turned around, there was nothing but the dense, unblinking forest. After 3 days of survival, John had managed to construct a rudimentary shelter. The materials from his shipwreck were sparse, but he had enough to make a lean-to that could provide him with some protection against the elements. He had set up a basic fire pit, using some of the metals and stones from the wreckage to craft a rudimentary grill to cook whatever wildlife he could catch. But that was the problem, catching wildlife. The jungle was teeming with life, yet hunting it had proved near impossible. The creatures here were agile, fast, and unnervingly intelligent. He had been forced to adapt, scavenging for anything that might resemble food. Some of the local flora was edible, but the risk of poisoning himself was high. Every decision was a gamble. It wasn't until the 4th day that he came across something truly dangerous, something that, for all his training, he could never have predicted. He was stalking a large, multi-limbed creature, about the size of a bull, with thick, rubbery hide and 4 muscular legs that allowed it to move with astonishing speed. It wasn't the creature itself that alarmed him, but the figures he saw just beyond it. Several humanoid figures, crouched low in the underbrush, eyes glinting in the dim light of the planet's twin moons. They were the Zaunor, the alien tribe that ruled this region. At first glance, the Zaunor looked like something out of a nightmare. Their bodies were tall and gaunt, covered in dark, mottled skin that seemed to shimmer in the low light. Their faces were elongated, with deep-set eyes that gleamed with intelligence. Their most prominent feature, however, was their teeth, razor-sharp and triangular, protruding from their upper and lower jaws like the fangs of a predatory animal. John had been trained to recognize threats immediately, and his body tensed, preparing for a confrontation. But despite their intimidating appearance, the Zaunor moved with a grace and coordination that suggested they were more than just brutish predators. These were sentient beings, capable of advanced strategy and, he suspected, communication. They weren't just mindless hunters, they were a tribe, and they had been watching him. He knew he had to act fast. He had no weapons on him, aside from the knife he'd forged from scrap metal back at his camp, and no way of calling for help. But he had one advantage: they didn't know he had spotted them. Yet. John drew his knife from his belt, the metal hilt cool against his palm, and waited for the right moment. His eyes never left the nearest Zaunor, who was crouched low, its eyes locked on the creature he had been stalking moments before. He knew that if he made a wrong move now, it wouldn't be just him who was hunted, it would be a dozen or more Zaunor, working together to bring him down. The Zaunor were predators, but they were also methodical, and they were focused on the hunt. That was his window. As the lead Zaunor lunged toward the creature, John sprang into action. He didn't charge them. He moved with the careful precision of a predator himself, ducking behind a tree trunk and moving silently through the shadows. His instincts kicked in. One wrong move and he'd be dead, but if he played this right, he could escape without ever having to face them in open combat. He circled around, positioning himself behind the closest of the Zaunor. They were fast, but they were too focused on the larger creature. He had the element of surprise. With a surge of energy, he darted forward, covering the distance between himself and the nearest Zalnor in seconds. Before it could react, he grabbed it by the neck and slammed it into the ground, the sharp tip of his makeshift knife pressing against the soft, exposed throat. The Zalnor let out a strangled hiss, and its companions froze, momentarily confused. John's heart raced, but he maintained control, holding his position. "Move and I slit your throat," he muttered in the most menacing tone he could muster. The other Zalnor hesitated, unsure of how to respond. John's presence and the suddenness of the attack had thrown them off balance. They seemed to communicate through a series of clicks and hisses, what might have been their language, but it wasn't enough to gain an advantage over him. For a few moments, there was tense silence, with John holding the Zalnor captive beneath him. He didn't know what would happen next, but he wasn't about to let his guard down. Finally, the Zalnor who had been closest to him, a large, imposing figure, raised its hands in what seemed like a gesture of surrender. It spoke in its strange, clicking language, but this time, John recognized a tone of respect in its voice. The others began to lower their weapons, their tense posture easing into something more curious than confrontational. John kept the knife at the ready but began to back away slowly, still not entirely trusting them. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes now, not with so many eyes on him. But for the first time since the crash, he wasn't certain whether he'd just fought for his life or whether he'd earned the respect of the alien tribe. This was no ordinary encounter. The Zalnor were different from the savages he had initially assumed them to be. They had intelligence, strategy, and an understanding of tactics. And if he was going to survive here, if he was going to escape or communicate with any other race, he would need to learn everything he could about them. That night, John didn't sleep. Instead, he observed them from a distance, as they regrouped near the carcass of the creature he had been hunting. The Zalnor did not appear to be merely aggressive, they were calculating. They respected strength, but they also understood negotiation. His ability to overpower one of them had earned him temporary safety. The question remained, could he use this respect to his advantage, or would it only be a matter of time before they turned on him again? One thing was certain, John had just learned his first lesson about the Zalnor tribe. It wasn't brute force alone that would determine his survival, it was his ability to read the situation, adapt, and above all, communicate. If he could figure out how to talk to them, he might just be able to survive this strange new world. And maybe, just maybe, find a way to escape. But for now, his survival depended on the next move. And John Carter was always prepared for the next move. The tension had been building for days. John had long suspected that the Zalnor tribe was aware of his presence. He'd seen their signs, broken branches, claw marks on trees, and the occasional flash of reptilian eyes through the underbrush. He had made every effort to stay out of sight, but every time he tried to hunt or gather resources, the atmosphere grew thicker with hostility. There was a dangerous intelligence in their movements, a patience that unsettled him. It wasn't long before his suspicions were confirmed. One evening, as John sat at his campfire, sharpening a makeshift spear from the debris of his ship, he heard the unmistakable sound of rustling in the bushes. His instincts kicked in before his mind had time to process. He dropped to a crouch, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his side, his eyes scanning the surroundings. His heart rate accelerated as the rustling grew louder, and in a split second, his ears caught the sound of a footfall, soft yet deliberate. Suddenly, the bushes parted, and a figure stepped into the clearing. It was one of the Zalnor. Tall, muscular, its reptilian skin was a mix of emerald and obsidian, with piercing yellow eyes that glowed in the dim light of the fire. The creature was clad in rough, primitive armor, constructed from pieces of bone and hide. Its sharp claws glinted in the firelight as it regarded him coldly. John remained perfectly still, his breath shallow, analyzing the creature's posture. The Zalnor was not making any aggressive moves, yet. It merely watched him, as if waiting for something, gauging his reaction. The creature's eyes narrowed, and it slowly raised a hand, revealing a crude weapon, a spear made from a bone, tipped with something that gleamed like polished obsidian. John was already calculating his odds, mentally running through the options, disengage, fight, or try to talk. Every fiber of his being told him to fight. He was good at it, and he wasn't afraid of a physical confrontation, but there was something about the creature's stillness that made him hesitate. It wasn't hostile yet, not truly. Not today, John muttered to himself under his breath, taking a cautious step back. The Zalnor made a strange clicking sound, almost like a hiss, and lowered the spear slightly. It wasn't a retreat, but it was not an immediate attack either. John raised his hands, showing his palms, signaling he wasn't going to make a move, at least, not yet. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. A low voice rumbled from the creature's throat, its words guttural and foreign. John couldn't understand the language, but the tone was unmistakably confrontational. John frowned, thinking fast. This wasn't an isolated encounter. It was likely a scouting party. He was outnumbered, and the Zalnor were known to fight in packs. His best chance was to avoid an open conflict if he could. "Look, I don't want trouble," John said in the calmest voice he could muster, though his hand instinctively hovered over the butt of his sidearm. "I'm just trying to survive here. No harm, no foul." The Zalnor didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head, an odd, reptilian gesture that conveyed confusion, or perhaps curiosity. Then, as if to test him, it took another slow step forward, bringing the tip of the spear closer to John's chest. The standoff lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. John's mind raced, calculating all the ways this could go wrong. He had the upper hand in a direct confrontation. He was faster, smarter, and had more experience with hand-to-hand combat. But what he didn't have was knowledge of the terrain. He had no idea how many Zalnor were out there, hiding in the trees, waiting for their moment to strike. One wrong move, and he could find himself swarmed and overwhelmed. Then, as quickly as it had come, the tension broke. The creature suddenly dropped its spear to the ground and raised both hands in an unusual gesture of peace. It made the same clicking sound, then nodded at him. John blinked, unsure if he was reading this correctly. This wasn't how a predator behaved. A low voice, another Zalnor, called out from the shadows. John turned instinctively, his eyes narrowing. Another figure emerged, this one even larger than the first, its heavy-footed steps loud against the forest floor. "Kazakh," the new figure said in the same guttural language, and the first Zalnor lowered its head in what could only be described as respect. The newcomer was more intimidating, its scales darker and more pronounced, the thick armor of bone and hide adorned with strange symbols etched into the surface. It held a massive blade in its hands, a weapon that looked as though it could cleave through solid rock. This one didn't speak, at least not directly. Instead, it fixed John with a cold, calculating stare, as if assessing his worth. John felt his heart rate spike again. This was no random scout, this was a leader, or at the very least, an elite warrior. But what could he do? He wasn't in a position to fight both of them, and likely a dozen others lurking just beyond his line of sight. His mind raced, but instead of drawing his weapon, John made a decision. He would talk. Negotiation wasn't just a skill, it was his best weapon here. He knew this could turn into a bloodbath in an instant, but there was a chance, a small one, that he could avoid it. He dropped to one knee, lowering his gaze to the ground, his hands now flat in a submissive gesture. He spoke slowly, in a voice that was firm but non-threatening. "I don't know your customs or your language," John began, his voice calm. "But I know a fight will only lead to more death. I don't want that. You don't want that. If we can reach some understanding, maybe we can find a way that doesn't involve killing each other." The leader of the Zalnor, Kazakh, John assumed, didn't move for several long moments. The silence stretched between them, unbearable. Then, to his surprise, Kazakh spoke. "Human, weak," it growled, its voice deep and resonant. "But clever." The alien's eyes studied John carefully. "We do not kill for no reason. But you, trespass. Intruder." John's mind raced. This was his opening. "I didn't come here by choice. My ship crashed. I'm stranded. You want me to leave?" I don't have a way to do that. He met Kazak's gaze, his voice unwavering. I've been trying to survive, just like you. But I'm not your enemy. I don't want to fight. I want to live. Can we agree on that? The leader stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. It was almost like time slowed, as if the alien was measuring his words. Then, with a sudden grunt, Kazak raised his weapon, not in anger but in a signal of sorts. The first Zalnor, still standing watch, nodded and backed away, lowering its spear in a gesture of reluctant respect. The standoff wasn't over. But for the first time, it felt like there was a way forward. Kazak spoke again, his words gruff but deliberate. Survive. Prove strength. Then we see. John took a slow breath, rising to his feet. It wasn't an alliance, not yet. But it was a start. The Zalnor had drawn a line in the sand: survival. Strength. If he could prove himself, he might yet have a chance to escape this planet alive. For the first time since he'd crash-landed here, John allowed himself a small, cautious smile. He had survived the first test. Now, the real fight for his life began.